Welcome back. In last video, we covered how, because of philosophy, Jews had all kinds of questions about Hashem. And because of these questions, they had a very difficult time sticking to Yiddishkeit. The reason being is because they had these questions, but they were not allowed to ask these questions. They weren't allowed to approach anyone, weren't allowed to ask Rabbanim these questions. And if they would, Rabbanim would say, we're not allowed to discuss it because one has to have simple faith, emunah pshuta, in Hashem. So, in this video, we're going to cover in this lesson, we're going to cover what did the Chachamim do to solve this problem? What did the Chachamim do to stem the tide of Yidden frying out? Now, this happened, historically, this happened at the time, mostly of the Rishonim. A little bit before, around the beginning of the Rishonim. You have, for example, the Rambam and Reb Sadia Gaon were major forces in helping stemming the tide, and we'll tell you how. The Rambam and the Reb Sadia Gaon and the Rishonim decided that in order to save Yiddishkeit, it was better that Yidden should be able to ask questions about Hashem than not. Because if they wouldn't, then there would be no or very few Yidden left. And so for the sake of saving thousands and thousands of Jews from frying out and leaving Yiddishkeit, they decided to, so to speak, break the rule of not asking questions about Hashem. Now, this concept is not a new concept. There's such a thing called Eis Lasis Lashem Heferu Teresecha. There's a pasuk in the Torah where the Chachamim took this from, where the Chachamim learned from this pasuk in the Torah that in certain circumstances where the Chachamim decide that they are allowed to break a specific rule in the Torah in order to save Yidden from frying out. One example of this, another example where in history this happened, was the writing down of the Mishnayos and the Gemara. Before Mishnayos, all of this was Torah Sheba'al Peh. People had to know this by heart. But because of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi realized that people were forgetting all of the Mishnayos, in order for Torah not to be forgotten, they decided to break the rule of not writing down Torah Sheba'al Peh in order to save it. So this is not a completely novel concept, and there are very specific rules in how this works, and the Chachamim discuss this in many places how this works. But concerning us, the Rishonim, especially the Rambam and the Reb Sadia Gaon, decided to write Sfarim in Chakira. And what this means are Chakira meaning philosophy. The Rambam and Reb Sadia Gaon wrote down Sfarim. A number of other Rishonim also did, but these are just from the more famous ones. They wrote Sfarim to answer the questions that Yidden were asking. And what they essentially decided to do was to use this box of Chakira, this box of philosophy, because philosophy works within a certain framework, a certain assumption, which is that everything has to be logical, everything has to make sense from an intellectual perspective. For example, things that are emotional don't fit into philosophy. It has to fit into an intellectual. And nothing that's higher than intellect either works in it, like emunah or belief does not fit into philosophy. So the Rambam and Reb Sadia Gaon kind of squeeze a circle into a square by creating Sfarim that worked within the framework of philosophy and within the laws of philosophy answered these questions that Yidden were having. And essentially, there's large amounts of Svarim that were written on the subject and many pages, and we're obviously not going to go through a whole sefer, but one of the main things that Chakira came up with, that the Rambam and Reb Sadia Gaon explained concerning Hashem, was a concept called Dibra Torah Kalashon B'nei Adam. Dibra Torah Kalashon B'nei Adam means that the Torah speaks in the manner of people. Meaning to say, whenever a pasuk were to say that Hashem hit the Egyptians with this big hand, or Hashem got angry, or Hashem's 7 eyes, I'm just making up something here, but Hashem's 7 eyes looked at the people in Nineveh, what the Torah was really saying, the Rambam explained, or Reb Sadia Gaon explained, was that the Torah was just speaking in terms of like a mashal, of like a parable about Hashem, because obviously Hashem doesn't have 17 eyes and 33 feet or 10 fingers. It's not how Hashem is. Hashem is higher than that. And so within the terms of philosophy, they explained that the Torah wasn't saying that Hashem literally had 10 hands or had these physical characteristics. What the Torah was saying was just like, for example, a person would look at someone who he's watching carefully. So Hashem was also, so to speak, watching them, whatever that means from a Hashem perspective. It was just for us to be able to understand and kind of get an idea of what Hashem was doing. And so through this kind of answering, going through each of the examples in the Torah and describing it obviously in a little bit more detail and a little bit more complex than what we're saying now, explaining how this works, the Rambam and Reb Saadia Gaon and the other Rishonim were able to stem the tide, and thousands of Yidden not only were saved, but many, many that fried out started coming back to Yiddishkeit. And they realized that it wasn't a contradiction. Philosophy wasn't a contradiction to the Torah. They felt that philosophy and Torah did not contradict each other, and that Hashem could still exist and be relevant in their lives and be important, and you have to keep the mitzvahs. And philosophy didn't necessarily upschlag or contradict or take away any of these things, and they were able to understand that. And this was a very, very, very big help to Jews, because they had all these questions, and what the Rishonim kind of did was that they broke this ice where Yidden were allowed to ask Rabbanim questions, and many Rabbanim would sit and learn these svarim from the Rambam and from the Reb Saadia Gaon and others, and be able to answer them. Now, just a point of information here is that the Rambam wrote a sefer called Moreh Nevuchim. There was a number of svarim the Rambam wrote about philosophy, but Moreh Nevuchim was very famous because the Moreh Nevuchim was made for people who were already fried out and were looking to come back and needed answers. It was kind of like, imagine if the Rebbe were to write a book on science, and for people who, believed in science and he wanted to bring them back to Yiddishkeit, and he wrote a book explaining all the things of science and coming back, explaining them according to the Torah. So this is what the Rambam did. And because of this, for many, many hundreds of years, Yidden were doing amazing. From an intellectual perspective, the Rambam kind of, and Reb Saadia Gaon kind of stemmed the tide, and things were looking good again. This all worked out until about 700 or 750 years ago. About 750 years ago, the Zohar was discovered. And with the Zohar, some new questions, some new problems arose. And in the next video, we're going to discuss what these problems were and how the Chachamim dealt with these issues. Stay tuned.